Dark Night continues right now, and to do so, we're going to look at a couple different things that will hopefully help people get through this a little easier. And the first one, of course, is accepting that there is no way back. Okay, and this is probably the big one. Hi, Carol. Nice to see you. How are you? Finally catching me live. I'm usually live, although sometimes I've been known to be dead. So the first part of getting through the dark night of the ego instead of the dark night of the soul is accept that there is no way back. Oh yes, my wife Kelly and her piano piece. We're planning to get more of those on the go as soon as she does her part. So, once the conscious awareness, the conscious awakening process reaches a certain point, because in reality, we are all under a process of awakening, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. The reality is that we are under that process of awakening. When we become consciously aware of our awakening process, that's when everything begins to go awry from the egoic point of view. You've fallen down the rabbit hole, and you have to accept that there is no way back out of the rabbit hole. You can never drop your consciousness back to match where it once was. That would be a devolution of your being instead of an evolution of your being. And we do not devolve in that sense. At an egoic sense, we can certainly dissolve. Ah, Susan's here too. Hello, Susan. Nice to see you. We were having a few laughs because Carol said she got to see me live. Oh, Jennifer's here too. Hi, Jennifer. Nice to see you as well. And I said, well, I'm usually live, but sometimes I'm dead, half dead. I felt half dead this afternoon. Needed a 45-minute nap. Must be my old age. So, but back to the dark night of the ego. And on one hand, this is a fairly serious conversation because, this stuff drives my wife nuts. It really does with her family. And we're going to get to that sort of thing. So, in the first step is to accept, of course, that there is no way back. Once your consciousness has come up a notch, there is no way to return to that lower disc, as Abraham Hicks would say. You're on a higher flying disc. Your vibrations come up. Your consciousness awareness has come up. You can't go back or put yourself back to sleep. So the very, very first step is to accept that once you've fallen down that rabbit hole, once you've become consciously aware of your evolutionary growth into conscious awareness, there is no way back from that. Once you've woken up, the process begins. You cannot go back to sleep. Ah, hello, Devora. And Devora's here too. Awesome. I'm glad to see everyone tonight. So again, first part, accepting that there is simply no way back. The second part we have to address is that you simply will not be able to explain yourself. If someone's consciousness has not risen right along with yours, right alongside of yours, is not prepared for that, is not high enough or open enough already, no amount of explaining will ever change or fix anything. And as a matter of fact, a lot of times what will happen is it'll actually get worse. Because inside, even though the person may be smiling and nodding their head at you, in their head, the only thing that they're saying is that you've gone totally crazy. So this is the path that we face, okay? When you try to explain yourself, what you're actually doing is you're splitting your energy. You're giving half of your being back to that old system again. Trying to talk to someone who can't possibly understand where you are at. And Kelly goes through this with the family, and this is where we're going to bring in what happens with religion and religions that separate. Okay? And this is a very big part of it. Any religion that separates family members based on belief is hypocritical. It just is. Christ did not care whether you were a noble, a religious leader, or a prostitute. He gave his compassion freely to everyone who would accept it. Openly, honestly, with no regard for what the people chose to believe at the time. No religion that separates a family member because that family member no longer chooses to believe is truly a religion. It's actually just a cult. And we've talked about the danger of cults and what happens with the mentality, okay? You and my wife has struggled with this so many times. You know, she's just like, well, if I can just sit down and explain to them, if I can just explain what happened, there are not, and this is the problem when we talk about ego and when we talk about enlightenment and when we talk about awareness. We simply cannot put into words what we've actually gone through. And there are no words to describe. And maybe that little trailer video on that Carlton Pearson movie, Come Sunday, is a good example of that. You wake up in the middle of the night and you realize there's a voice in your head that tells you there are no sinners. Everyone's going to heaven. There is no damnation. I'm not that sort of a God. And you come to church on Sunday, and that's the only thing you can say. And all of a sudden, everyone around you, and Devorah is right, they've been asleep, they're brainwashed, they're programmed. And my wife knows this programming well, because not 5 years ago, maybe, at the most, yeah. 5 years ago, my wife would be behaving exactly the same way her family is right now. And thinking somehow that that was loving them back into the fold. Now, see, here's the crux, okay? Here's the piece that everyone who is waking up needs to get. Your consciousness is coming up, but you still have your ego. You haven't gone by the ego yet. You haven't put it fully in its place. The ego still takes you into unconsciousness. The ego still causes you to feel certain ways based on your thoughts. And this is okay. But it hurts. And the reason it hurts is because you have a piece of you that's looking into this new expansive universe that you've just become aware of, like a new baby. You've literally been born again to a new level of consciousness. But there's a chunk of you that is still anchored in that old state. It's still anchored with the people who were associated with that old state of being. It's still anchored with the job or the relationship or the family members from that old state of being, and it hates change. The ego hates letting go of anything. And in the worst cases, we as awakening beings take the blame onto ourselves for the behavior of our family members towards us, as I've seen my wife do. You know, in moments of extreme frustration, she's even tried to blame me for it. And I totally understand. Although I do call her on it all the time. The next point that we have to consider is that we honestly must let go what we fear to lose the most. And this is the hardest part, okay? How do you let, and you know this Yoda says this in Star Wars, and when I heard that the first time, believe it or not, the first time I heard it was in 1971 in Star Wars. It was the very first screening of the movie. I was 11 years old, and it was in a drive-in. And we had that one speaker on a cord that you had to put inside the window with the tinny sound. But when Yoda said those words, let go what you fear to lose the most, it struck a chord with me. And I realized that any time I feared to lose something, that was usually a guarantee that I was going to lose it. And the reason being is I was holding on to it. I thought I needed it in some way. And the more I feared to lose it and the more I thought about it, the more those fears began to attract, that those thoughts began to attract more thoughts about fearing to lose it. And pretty soon the universe said, okay, if this is what you're focusing on, you will receive your wish. You will lose it. You will lose it. When we let go what we fear to lose the most, we honestly give it the best opportunity to choose to stay with us in open hands or to fly on its own. Now, sometimes letting go of what you fear to lose the most works the other way. It's you who have to let go. You who have to remove yourself from the picture. And that may be the hardest decision a person has to make, especially when they're still anchored in the dark night of the ego. Part of them is waking up, and yet part of them is holding on to something they know doesn't serve them anymore, but they just don't want to let go of it. And I understand these feelings. I really do, because I see them in my wife, and I feel them. I literally feel them. You know, she sat there today and started to make a list of the points that she wishes to talk to her mother about one day. And I could just watch her whole energy going like that. And the reason that happens to us is because at our higher level of consciousness that we've come up to, we don't understand anymore why the person would behave that way. Because we can't. We've lost the understanding. Even though Kelly was in that position not more than 5 years ago, she still hadn't realized today that, oops, I would be treating my other family members exactly the same way just 5 years ago. And you wouldn't have been able to convince her otherwise. Devora asks, what did I fear back when I was 11 years old? Not a lot. I was a pretty independent child, you know. My dad was never around, and my mother was quite ill. So I you know what? I'll tell you the one thing I did fear. I feared being taken into a foster home. That's what I did. Because I had pretty much complete freedom at 11 years old. Complete freedom. My mother was too sick to do much about it. I fed myself and my sister. I went to school. I worked part-time jobs and odd jobs and had a paper route and was very self-sufficient. But I did fear going into a foster home. That I did. So, letting go what you fear to lose the most. Why is this the most important thing that we must realize? And I'm going to try to make this as clear as possible. The idea that relationship with other people represents, as Dvorak says, security, is a phantom. It's not real. It's a manufactured thought from ego. There is no security in family. There is a perceived security, certainly, but that security is false. And if you've ever had any real troubles in your family, you'll understand how false that security can actually become, and quite quickly. The only true security comes in becoming a complete and whole being yourself, which does not mean you do not wish for the interactions of other people's, because I personally enjoy interacting with other people. But it does mean not being attached to it. I can go spend a week in a cabin by myself in the woods and feel just as good. Now, a lot of people say, well, I can't do it. How do I let go? As Dvorak says, it's real to us. She's guessing until it's not. And that's exactly it. The same with suffering, is it's real until it's not. We accept suffering and we think we're suffering until we understand that we are simply choosing to suffer. And in all honesty, the same thing applies here. When Kelly's mother has refused to give her so much as the time of day for 3 years now, my wife has allowed herself to suffer because she has invested part of her identity and sense of self into, I'm my mother's daughter, and my mother should not be treating me this way, and life is not fair, and the list of these other things, these other lies that we tell ourselves goes on, and we buy it. Our society has led us to the point, and unfortunately a great deal of it has to do with the dominant male influence in our society that has pushed women to cling to the mother identity at all costs as the last bastion of femininity in a totally male-dominated world. And as women who come from the creative, warmer, womb-like, open, energetic manifestation of one half of the whole, I fully understand how separation from family members, especially your children, over religion or your belief systems or where your consciousness has gone through, can feel devastating. But I encourage you to allow them to walk their own path. Everyone must suffer until they understand that it's their choice to perceive suffering. And, Dvorak makes a comment. She says, it blows my mind that we choose to suffer. That's crazy when no one wants to suffer. And it's true, in part of your head, and it's the ego that says, well, I shouldn't have to suffer. That's the part that doesn't want to suffer. And then we look at our children and we say, well, we don't want suffering from our children or for our children. But we fail to understand that it is a necessary part of our evolution, of our growth. It is the suffering that makes us reach for more, that helps us to transcend our current state of being. It brings us to a place where we finally say enough. And here's the eventuality in Kelly's case. Sooner or later, she's going to have to make an attempt to contact her mother. And that contact will go well or it won't go well. If it goes well, there may be a road forward. Although, as we've discussed, there's not a lot of commonality going on right now. And that can get in the way. When your conscious level comes up a bit, there's no real ability to relate anymore on either end when someone is still stuck in an archaic belief system. You can't drag the horse to the water. Well, you can, but you can't make him drink. Although you can drown him in it. So, when we let go what we fear to lose the most, what we do is we invite nature, the universe, to do its work. We allow what is. We accept that it took all that time for our path, and that we don't honestly know where that person is in their journey. You see, even if it's your child, you're thinking of it temporally in this life. You're not seeing it as a shard of a larger, grander, higher consciousness that's manifesting this life among many lives. And the hardest thing can be to accept when it's simply no longer necessary for us or someone else to be walking alongside us anymore. The paths are diverging. One path is leading up to the right side of the mountain. The other path is leading off to the left. And your son or your husband or your wife or your partner or your daughter or your nephew or aunt or relative or friend is choosing a different path. We have to find balance and have respect for the path that others are on, not assume that simply because our consciousness has come up a little bit that we have the right to interfere with or make them do what we wish. That's part of the reason why we're here, is to learn to be conscious creators. Sandra says, my family was very toxic and she had to walk away 6 or 7 years ago, and that started her healing journey, and I'm good with them out of my life. And Sandra, that's fantastic, but I would imagine that it took time to let go. You had to suffer enough. You had to be beaten about enough in whatever way it was happening to finally say, I choose not to anymore. And this is the gift that we have. We can choose not to. We can choose to end the suffering for ourselves. Now, that does not mean we have to hate our family members. I mean, my wife still loves her mother. Of course she does. But just like the baby who spills the milk, we're not going to beat up our family member for being at the state of consciousness they're in. It always comes back to acceptance and surrender. We have to surrender to what is. We have to put our eyes forward on expanding our consciousness even more, expanding into our new spaciousness. Now, it may seem to be counterintuitive. You're saying, wait a minute, you want me to turn my back on me trying to get back into my family's life or trying to hold this relationship together and focus on myself as an answer? That's selfish. It's not selfish. It's called being self-centered. You understand that you as a whole powerful spiritual being coming into the awareness can only affect others around you positively. Your new vibrational state will draw to you the people you need, the people who have to be there right now. the people who synchronistically belong in your existence. And letting go of family and friends does not mean you will never, ever see them. And Sandra says she still loves her family, but that took time also, and I understand that. I hated my mother and father. My father for sexually abusing me and my sister, my mother for doing nothing about it and for being deathly ill, my father for having a heart attack and dying when I was, 9.5 or so years old, and my mother for taking her own life and committing suicide. I hated the both of them. It wasn't until many years later, as my consciousness began to grow, that I came to understand that they did the best they could with the consciousness they had at the time, and furthermore, I chose them. I chose them and they played their roles perfectly. This may be the hardest thing for anyone to accept, and that is the understanding that we actually choose our roles. And when we understand that we choose our roles and we choose our parents, we can come to this candle flame. We can come to that point inside where we understand that that sibling we're arguing with, or that is no longer in the same state that we're in, or that loved one who's no longer communicating with us, it's all been preordained. The path has all been laid out. And the paths will reconverge one day again. They can't help but reconverge. We are literally all one. There can never be any loss. This continuing dark night of the soul will last and last and last until we consciously choose to end it. And it isn't a one-time choice. As I've said to my wife, as with everything else, you have to keep choosing it. You have to keep choosing it over and over and over again. You have to keep letting go. Let go. We all lie in the arms of the Creator. And yet, most of us are trying to grab and hold on to the fabric and the cloth on his arm or her arm, the cosmic arms, that sea of consciousness. We don't have to do anything. We just have to sit back and enjoy the ride and surrender that those who come and go in our lives come and go for a reason. When we let go, when we turn to gratitude for the role they had in our lives, and we let go when we need to let go, we begin to work in harmony with our higher selves. And trust me, in the same way that Kelly came into my life after 22 years, 284 days of letting go, she finally showed up. And 22 years meant nothing. I feel like I've known her for 1,000 years. Boy, do I feel like I've known you for 1,000 years.
We have.
Much love to you all, and have a wonderful evening. And we will see you all again very soon. Next broadcast will be via YouTube. Our internet's being upgraded tomorrow morning, finally. And we'll, of course, keep you in the loop during the week. Namaste, and have a wonderful night.